12 American soldiers collapsed at the same diner in under 10 minutes. No gunshots, no struggle. Plates still warm, chairs overturned, coffee dripping from shattered mugs. No one saw who did it. No one saw anything at all. The medics arrived to a scene frozen in silence, faces pale, mouths agape, hearts stopped mid-beat. Whispers of sabotage swirled through the ranks, but no evidence surfaced. Only fear. Was it a new weapon, a ghost from the forest, or something far worse? But some stories refused to stay silent. On February 23, 1964, in a sleepy Connecticut town, local patrons gathered at Miller's Grove Diner, a cozy roadside spot known for its pies, coffee, and proximity to a nearby Air Force testing facility. Within 20 minutes, half the customers were convulsing. Initial suspicion? A tainted batch of meatloaf. But what investigators uncovered in the days that followed pointed to something far darker, a Soviet chemical attack disguised as a foodborne illness. Miller's Grove, a modest roadside diner nestled along Route 74 in northern Connecticut, looked like any number of small-town eateries scattered across the American landscape. Neon sign flickering above the door, booths lined with red vinyl, and a bell that jingled each time the front door opened. But what set this diner apart wasn't the apple pie or the bottomless coffee. It was its proximity to Wrightson Research Airfield, a top-secret test facility camouflaged as a sleepy airstrip. Just 10 miles to the northeast, behind layers of barbed wire and government-issued silence, engineers were developing aircraft that didn't officially exist. High-altitude reconnaissance prototypes designed to breach Soviet radar systems and collect images at the edge of space. By day, Wrightson's staff clocked in under heavy clearance, studying radar deflection technology, camera calibration for orbital photography, and the next generation of aerial surveillance platforms. By noon, many of them drove out for lunch, unaware that their dining habits were of any interest to foreign powers. Miller's Grove, with its open seating and small-town anonymity, became a predictable stop. It offered the illusion of privacy while doubling as a gathering point for some of the most sensitive minds in Cold War aeronautics. To the FBI and CIA, the location raised subtle red flags, a diner positioned like a flytrap for classified chatter, but with no known incidents, it remained low on their list of active concerns. That complacency would prove costly. Regulars included not just airfield engineers, but contracted software developers, fuel systems analysts, and even a few retired military advisors now working in civilian consultancy. The staff, largely unaware of the diner's strategic magnetism, joked about the Rocket Boys from Wrightson, who always tipped well and carried briefcases. Unbeknownst to them, however, the KGB had long marked Miller's Grove as a site of potential value, not just for overheard conversations or planted bugs, but for something bolder: psychological sabotage. Soviet intelligence had grown increasingly desperate to stall American advancements in aerial surveillance, particularly those designed to monitor Russian ICBM installations from 80,000 feet. If even one prototype test could be delayed, disrupted, or dismantled, it would give the Kremlin room to recalibrate their countermeasures. The choice to target a diner may have seemed erratic on the surface, but it followed an emerging Soviet pattern: strike softly in the margins, at the edges of military infrastructure where accountability blurs and deniability thrives. Miller's Grove, with its tight community feel and easy access, was ideal. Nobody asked questions. Nobody suspected the quiet man at the corner booth. And when the incident finally unfolded, investigators would be left to piece together not just how it had happened, but why the place had ever been ignored in the first place. What looked like a simple eatery was, in reality, a pressure point in the American intelligence apparatus, and the Soviets had just placed their thumb on it. It began with 3 Turkey Club sandwiches, delivered at precisely 12:47 p.m. by waitress Karen Healy, a 26-year-old single mother of 2 who had worked at Miller's Grove for 6 years and could navigate the lunchtime rush blindfolded. The sun filtered through the smeared windows as the noontime regulars, government contractors, a retired Navy pilot, 2 teachers from the nearby high school, and a pair of young engineers from Wrightson, sipped coffee and chatted over their usual orders. Everything seemed perfectly normal until 12:55, when the man in booth 4, Raymond Kell, a hydraulic systems technician, slumped forward into his plate, his fork clattering to the floor. At first, Karen thought he was having a seizure, but then the woman at the counter began coughing violently, her eyes watering, her fingers trembling, as she reached for her throat. Within the next 3 minutes, a cascade of chaos erupted inside the diner. A young boy on a field trip vomited into his mother's lap. A man in a business suit staggered from the restroom, only to collapse by the pie display. And two elderly sisters, Elsie and Marjorie Trent, began mumbling incoherently, their hands twitching uncontrollably on the formica table as half-eaten slices of cherry pie slid onto the floor. By 1 p.m., the smell of stomach acid, spilled coffee, and fear filled the diner like smoke. Karen, frozen by the register, called 911 while the busboy, Benny Morales, tried to hold up a pale and sweating customer who was muttering something about burning from the inside. When the first paramedics arrived at 1:05, they found 12 patrons in varying stages of collapse. 3 unconscious, 5 disoriented and babbling nonsense, 4 vomiting into napkins, the floor, or their own hands. They moved quickly, triaging with oxygen masks, portable IVs, and rushed stretches, but no one could identify the cause. Food poisoning seemed the obvious culprit, yet confusion swept through the responders when they realized there was no common dish linking the victims. Some had only coffee, others milkshakes. A few were on salads or toast. What made the situation even stranger was the eerie calm of the staff. Karen, Benny, the cook, even the dishwasher. None of them exhibited any symptoms. They had all eaten the same food, used the same water, worked elbow to elbow in the same confined space, and yet not one so much as broke a sweat. The cook, Joe Renshaw, a Gulf War veteran with a habit of chewing toothpicks, stood outside the back door, chain-smoking and muttering, "This ain't no salmonella, man," while watching EMTs wheel out barely conscious customers. Within 15 minutes, the street outside was cordoned off by local police, the parking lot filled with flashing lights and worried neighbors, and 2 CDC liaisons were en route from Hartford. Inside the diner, amidst the overturned coffee mugs and forgotten fries, the air was thick with something more than the stench of vomit. It was the invisible weight of a mystery that had no precedent, no pattern, and no logic. Something had gone wrong, terribly, unnaturally wrong, and no one, not even the seasoned paramedics, could explain why a quiet Connecticut diner had suddenly turned into a war zone of invisible sickness. In the hours following the incident at Miller's Grove, the initial response was chaos in a lab coat. State health inspectors descended upon the diner by late afternoon, armed with thermometers, swabs, and clipboards, treating the scene like an outbreak of botulism or listeria, standard foodborne illnesses they were trained to handle. They collected leftover food samples, swabbed kitchen surfaces, bagged the contents of the trash bins, and interrogated a dazed Karen Healy who couldn't stop repeating that the turkey clubs had come out looking normal, just normal, as if saying it enough times might undo what had happened. The local police filed an incident report citing possible mass food contamination and awaited toxicology results from the nearby New Haven State Lab. News crews caught wind by evening, and a brief local TV segment aired before dinner. 12 fall ill at Route 74 diner, cause unknown. It might have ended there, with a media shrug and a few health code violations, if not for a phone call made at 8:17 p.m. from Wrightson Research Airfield to a Department of Defense liaison in Washington. The caller was Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Massey, an on-site intelligence monitor at Wrightson, who had been alerted that 2 of the victims, Roger Lynn and Caleb Stone, were currently being treated in intensive care for acute neurological failure. Both men were mid-level civilian contractors employed by Traskin Systems, a private defense firm with clearance to handle sensitive components for high-altitude recon prototypes. Lynn specialized in electromagnetic shielding for satellite-compatible aircraft. Stone worked on thermal imaging systems designed to evade infrared detection. The fact that both men had collapsed in the same diner at the same time, with no obvious symptoms shared by staff or other non-military customers, tripped every alarm Massey had been trained to recognize. Within the hour, a classified incident report was forwarded to the Bureau's Boston field office, and the file was stamped Priority Red, Immediate Review. By 6:45 a.m. the next day, 2 black Suburbans arrived at the diner carrying agents from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, led by Special Agent Martin Greaves, a soft-spoken man known internally for solving a 1972 biological infiltration case in Tucson involving a contaminated air filter at a naval facility. Greaves wasted no time. He requested all surveillance tapes from nearby gas stations, pulled phone records from the diner's landline, and ordered a full background check on every customer who had been on the premises that day. The case was no longer under local jurisdiction. It had been escalated to a national security event under Executive Directive 104 Alpha, which covered potential acts of foreign chemical interference on U.S. soil. The CDC team, still operating under foodborne protocols, was quietly pushed aside. What had been a mysterious case of lunchroom illness now reeked of deliberate design, and though Greaves didn't say it out loud, everyone in the room knew what was hanging in the air. This wasn't about food safety anymore. This was espionage. The initial lab reports came back with nothing. No signs of E. coli, no salmonella, no staph, no botulinum toxin, just a curious absence of explanation where one should have been. But when a second, more advanced analysis was conducted at a federal forensics lab in Quantico, Virginia, using gas chromatography mass spectrometry on samples taken from napkins, coffee residue, and even a smear from the side of a glass, the results changed everything. Hidden among the data points was a trace chemical signature that didn't match any known foodborne contaminant but bore an uncanny resemblance to a highly specialized neurotoxin first identified by Western analysts during the late 1950s. Substance 712, a clandestine nerve agent reportedly developed in a KGB-run chemical research lab near Novosibirsk. This was no accident. The compound acted fast, within 8 to 12 minutes of ingestion or dermal contact, disrupting neural pathways by mimicking acetylcholine and overstimulating the nervous system, leading to convulsions, respiratory distress, confusion, and eventual collapse. The molecule had no odor, no taste, and degraded rapidly into near-invisible trace elements, making detection incredibly difficult unless you knew exactly what you were searching for. Only 3 labs in the United States had the capacity to detect it, and even then, it required targeted suspicion. The fact that it was found at all pointed to one thing. Someone in the Bureau already suspected chemical espionage. The strain found at Miller's Grove was not pure substance 712, but a modified derivative, likely adapted to be less lethal but more psychologically disruptive, designed to incapacitate without killing, to confuse and terrify without crossing the line into mass homicide. The implication was chilling. This wasn't meant as an assassination. It was a message, a warning, an operational signature deliberately chosen to be detectable by American intelligence, if not obvious to the public. It spoke of precision, expertise, and intent. Someone had not only dosed multiple surfaces or consumables in the diner, they had done so in a way that bypassed conventional detection, suggesting both technical sophistication and inside knowledge of American emergency response protocols. Whoever had administered the toxin knew that if they used too much, the event would be catastrophic and uncontainable. But if they used just enough to paralyze, confuse, and nearly kill, Washington would take notice, and quietly. This wasn't an act of terror. It was an act of psychological warfare. The kind that said, "We're still here, and we're closer than you think." FBI counterintelligence immediately flagged the incident under codename Echo Frost, restricted access to the toxin's analysis to Tier 1 personnel, and dispatched covert inquiries to military bases across the eastern seaboard to determine whether any other unexplained illnesses had been reported in the past 6 months. None matched. This was a one-off event, and that made it even more dangerous, because that meant it had worked exactly as intended. The Soviets hadn't just developed a ghost toxin. They had walked it right into the heart of America's aerospace corridor and left it steaming in a coffee cup. The breakthrough came not from fingerprints or a confession, but from the grainy black and white security footage of a Sunoco gas station directly across from Miller's Grove, footage that had nearly been erased due to a routine overwrite schedule. One of the Bureau's junior agents, Evan Toller, requested the tape on a hunch, thinking the wide angle might have caught faces or vehicles exiting the diner's parking lot. At timestamp 12:51 p.m., 6 minutes before the first victim began vomiting, there appeared a man stepping briskly from the diner, alone, in a pressed gray suit with a neutral expression and dark sunglasses that did little to obscure the sharpness of his cheekbones. He crossed the street, entered a forest green Dodge Diplomat, and pulled out smoothly, heading east on Route 74. The plate was partially visible, DF87, enough to trigger a search through DMV and rental agency databases. The car had been rented from a budget branch in Hartford 3 days earlier using the name Martin Havel, along with a Maryland driver's license and matching insurance paperwork. But that's where the trail went cold. Martin Havel, according to the state death records, had died in Baltimore in '93. Cause of death, heart failure. He'd been 73. The ID used to rent the car was a perfect match in number, photo alignment, and embedded security features, but it had been forged on top of a dead man's identity, a textbook move in Cold War tradecraft. Whoever this man was, he wasn't Martin Havel. Cross-referencing facial recognition across old intelligence archives, Agent Greaves's team ran the gas station image through a declassified CIA program originally designed to track defectors during the Prague Spring. The match came back within 3 hours, low confidence at first, then stronger once enhanced images were analyzed under facial rotation algorithms. Yuri Alexeyevich Malenkov, codename Frostbite. A Soviet field agent believed to have been part of Department 5 of the KGB, specializing in sabotage, targeted poisoning, and covert psychological operations. Malenkov had vanished in 1961 after a suspected operation in Belgium involving the assassination of a U.S. attaché via mercury compounds. The CIA had presumed him dead or retired, possibly burned out or folded into internal Russian security services. There had been no credible sightings in nearly 4 decades, until now. The photo from the gas station showed a man in his early 60s, which would track with Malenkov's known birth year of 1938. The bone structure was nearly identical, brow angle, ear shape, mandible taper, and there was a faint scar under the left cheek, just barely visible in the light flare, matching a knife wound recorded in Malenkov's classified KGB personnel file. It was him, or someone who had studied him well enough to wear his face. But the Bureau wasn't ready to share that information publicly. If Malenkov was active again, it meant something had changed in Moscow's playbook. Something cold and old had been reawakened, and the fact that his return involved a silent chemical attack at a diner frequented by aerospace engineers suggested that this was only the opening move in a game that had been dormant for decades. It wasn't until the third wave of forensic sweeps, conducted by a specialized hazmat team from Fort Detrick under orders from the Department of Defense, that the truth emerged from the debris-strewn booths and coffee-stained linoleum of Miller's Grove. The vector wasn't the food, the cutlery, or the kitchen at all, it was the sugar. One of the team's chem bio specialists, Dr. Elaine Vargas, noticed a faint crystalline sheen along the threads of a metal sugar dispenser retrieved from table 7, a corner booth often used by solo diners or pairs. Curious, she ran a microparticle swab and subjected it to ion chromatography on site. The initial results came back with anomalous readings, trace amounts of synthetic cholinesterase inhibitors, structurally similar to substance 712, but coated with a polymer that allowed for delayed dissolution in high-temperature liquids. When tested further at the lab, the discovery was confirmed. The toxin had been aerosolized and bonded to a fine carrier powder, likely lactose or dextrose, to mimic the granularity of ordinary table sugar. The poison was activated only when introduced to heat, meaning that in cold drinks it would remain inert, but when stirred into steaming coffee or hot tea, it would dissolve silently, tastelessly, releasing its payload directly into the bloodstream through mucous membranes. Of the 12 confirmed victims, 5 had specifically used sugar from the contaminated dispenser. The remaining 7 had not, until investigators realized that those 7 had shared communal refill pitchers from a central table, each of which had been sweetened at the customer's request using sugar from the same dispenser. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a case of one person being targeted, or even 2. It was a wide-net operation designed to hit multiple unknowns at once, targeting the environment, not the individual. It was a method of psychological destabilization, impersonal, undetectable, and horrifyingly efficient. No one had seen the dispenser being tampered with. Security footage inside the diner didn't exist. Miller's Grove had never upgraded beyond a basic burglar alarm. But based on the timeline, Yuri Malenkov, under his false identity, had likely arrived early, possibly during the pre-lunch lull, ordered coffee, requested extra sugar, and then, with swift sleight of hand, replaced one of the stainless steel dispensers with an identical replica whose lid had been unscrewed, inner walls coated with the powder and resealed. It took less than 2 minutes. No contact, no syringes, no suspicious packages, just an ordinary condiment container weaponized with Cold War ingenuity. When Agent Greaves was briefed on the findings, his reaction was a whisper that turned to a curse. This wasn't just espionage, it was performance, a demonstration. The target wasn't a name on a list, it was the American sense of security itself. The sugar wasn't the poison, the predictability of the setting was. Malenkov had turned a breakfast staple into a delivery system for geopolitical fear. In one stroke, he had made every booth in every diner feel like a potential trap, a theater of vulnerability. And with no demand, no manifesto, and no body count that could be framed as a protest, the act remained maddeningly ambiguous. Just another whisper in a silent war, designed to make the U.S. intelligence community flinch at its own reflection. The question haunted every briefing room, from Langley to Fort Meade, in the days following the Miller's Grove incident. Why target a low-profile diner in a nowhere town? Why attack random patrons with no public significance, no clear diplomatic or military value? But buried deep in a once-buried CIA field memo, dated April 18, 1965, now declassified under Executive Order 13526, was the first piece of a larger, more unsettling puzzle. The memo, labeled OP Shadowline Route 74 Activity, documented low-priority surveillance conducted on Miller's Grove after analysts noticed an unusual clustering of Rights and Research airfield employees frequenting the location for their midday meals. It wasn't that the food was exceptional or the location strategic in any conventional sense. It was simply convenient, unremarkable, and out of the way, which ironically made it valuable. The diner provided a neutral environment where engineers, contractors, and even mid-clearance military personnel could chat over lunch without the looming pressure of on-base protocol. Analysts suspected that while the patrons weren't necessarily careless, the relaxed atmosphere fostered by the mundane environment might lead to incidental verbal leakage, technical phrases, offhand remarks, or discussions about workload that could, over time, be stitched into meaningful intelligence. The KGB, it seemed, had noticed the same pattern. Whether through intercepted comms, informants, or simply good old-fashioned boots-on-the-ground surveillance, they had identified Miller's Grove as a symbolic pressure point, a seemingly innocuous civilian space humming with invisible military value. But more disturbing than the surveillance potential was the message behind the attack. This wasn't about eliminating a key scientist or silencing a defector. No demands had been issued, no credits claimed. Instead, 12 people had been poisoned in broad daylight with surgical precision using a rare neurotoxin known only to intelligence agencies. It wasn't just meant to be effective, it was meant to be understood, a signature, a calling card from a ghost of the Cold War, breathing fresh terror into a new century. "We know who you are," the message said without saying. "We know where you eat, when you eat, and how to reach you in places where you feel safest." The psychological implications were devastating. If a public diner, one under passive observation by the U.S. government, could be infiltrated and turned into a weaponized space without triggering alarms, then nowhere was safe. It was the kind of operation not designed to achieve tactical objectives, but to seed doubt, hesitation, and fear in the very minds building the nation's most advanced defense systems. It worked. Within a week, Wrightson issued internal orders restricting off-site meals, mandating internal cafeterias for sensitive personnel, and placing plainclothes operatives in nearby commercial zones. Morale took a hit. Engineers started second-guessing their routines. Even unrelated defense contractors in Virginia and New Mexico began reporting suspicious diner activity out of sheer paranoia. The ripple effect was immediate. That was the brilliance of it. One silent toxin in one sugar jar had infected more than bloodstreams. It had infected trust, habit, and the illusion of civilian sanctuaries. The target was never the people. It was the idea that America's intelligence edge made it untouchable. And Yuri Malenkov had cracked that edge with a smile, a cup of coffee, and a chemical no one saw coming. In the weeks following the incident, Miller's Grove sat cordoned off behind a chain-link fence and yellow plastic sheeting, an eerie shell of its former self. The scent of bleach and charred upholstery lingering in the air as federal decontamination crews stripped it clean from floor to ceiling, though it was never reopened. None of the 12 poisoned patrons died, but 3, Roger Lynn, Caleb Stone, and an elderly woman named Helen Bryce, were diagnosed with permanent neurological impairments, chronic muscle tremors, blurred vision, and persistent cognitive dysfunction that resembled early-stage dementia. The official diagnosis, stamped on sanitized hospital charts, read, acute psic encephalopathy of unknown origin. Internally, the FBI declared the case classified under Level 4 Biohazard Incident Protocol, invoking a rarely used clause that allowed the Bureau to seal all documentation from public disclosure on the grounds of national emergency preparedness. No further statements were given to the press. The initial media frenzy, sparked by local radio reports of ambulances and hazmat teams, was quickly diverted. A controlled leak to the Associated Press stated that a cleaning chemical mishandling had released toxic fumes into the diner's ventilation system. An unfortunate, if mundane, industrial accident. By the time the Monday paper came out, the headline read, "Chemical spill at Route 74 diner sends 12 to hospital, no fatalities." Just like that, the story vanished. The diner was bulldozed 2 months later under a municipal zoning change, and the lot was paved into overflow parking for a used car dealership. But behind closed doors, the impact of the attack sent aftershocks through the entire intelligence community. The Pentagon convened a closed-door committee known only as Project Hearthstone, tasked with evaluating vulnerabilities across the civilian orbit of high-security facilities. Every cafeteria, diner, dry cleaner, and barbershop within 20 miles of sensitive installations was subjected to quiet reviews, with some vendors dropped overnight, others placed under subtle surveillance. Defense contractors received memos urging employees to limit casual discussion in public spaces, and several classified programs were paused for internal audits on information exposure. Fear, it seemed, did what no policy memo could. Yet despite the wave of defensive recalibrations, no arrests were made, no indictments were issued, and Yuri Malenkov, if that's who it truly was, vanished as smoothly as he had appeared, like a whisper folded into a classified document, undetected and unchallenged. His car was never recovered. The false identity used to rent it traced to a defunct alias bank believed to have been abandoned by the KGB decades earlier, and no fingerprints were ever matched to known databases. The Bureau's facial recognition match, while strong, was deemed not conclusive enough for formal attribution. That phrase, not conclusive enough, became the phrase of the year in counterintelligence briefings. Everyone knew who had done it, but no one wanted to admit that the Cold War, long thought to have faded into memory, still had its fingers in their coffee cups. In the end, justice wasn't served, it was avoided, because the only thing worse than knowing a ghost like Malenkov had returned was admitting you had no way to stop him if he did it again. Long after the scene was scrubbed, the files locked, and the victims left to rebuild what remained of their lives, the questions refused to die, gnawing at every analyst, agent, and military advisor who had touched the case. Why would a seasoned Soviet operative like Yuri Malenkov, if it was indeed him, resort to such a chaotic, public-facing method of attack? Why contaminate a sugar dispenser used by everyone, when the supposed targets, 2 Wrightson engineers, could have been followed and eliminated quietly, surgically, without risking exposure? Theories bloomed in the vacuum of answers like mold on sealed evidence. One camp believed it was a disruption operation, a psychological minefield laid with Cold War precision designed not to kill, but to stall. At the time of the incident, Wrightson was preparing a live test of the Falconet system, a high-altitude reconnaissance prototype, rumored to rival the capabilities of the now declassified SR-71 Blackbird. That test was postponed indefinitely in the wake of the poisoning, as half the Falconet team was among the sickened or under observation. The timing, some argued, was too perfect to be coincidence. The Soviets couldn't compete directly with the aircraft's surveillance tech, so instead they may have chosen to delay its development with fear and chaos, a scalpel wielded like a hammer. But others within the intelligence community weren't so sure. A second theory suggested something darker and more convoluted, that the incident had been staged not as a genuine Soviet strike, but as a false flag operation, engineered to fracture American confidence and stir internal distrust. The goal? To make it appear that the U.S. government had mishandled a chemical threat, perhaps even covered up an accidental release of its own classified compound. Several dissenting voices in the NSA pointed to an anomaly, an unexplained 47-minute blackout in Wrightson's secure network on the morning of the incident, suggesting that files or signals could have been intercepted, planted, or corrupted to simulate a security breach. Could a domestic faction, either rogue intelligence or a splinter cell, have staged the event to force a policy change, divert funding, or test counter-response capabilities? The idea seemed ludicrous, yet no less plausible than a vanished Soviet assassin defying death and time. A third, quieter theory floated within the walls of Langley late at night, spoke not of sabotage or framing, but of messaging, a ritual more than a mission. In that version, Malenkov wasn't there to poison people so much as poison trust. The act was symbolic, a dark art of Cold War theater meant to remind the United States that it could still bleed in unexpected places. And if Malenkov had chosen the method for maximum psychological resonance, sugar and coffee, the comfort of routine transformed into a vector of pain, then perhaps he had succeeded beyond his wildest ambitions. Whatever the truth, it was buried in competing hypotheses, redacted memos, and 1,000 silent conversations held in back rooms by men who knew that in espionage, certainty is a luxury, and ambiguity is often the deadliest weapon of all. 6 months after the incident, Miller's Grove stood in eerie stillness, its once busy windows coated in dust and sun-bleached flyers fluttering in the breeze like forgotten prayers. The "closed for renovation" sign remained taped to the door, but everyone in the town of New Canaan knew it was a lie. The booths had been ripped out, the appliances dismantled, but the air inside still carried a heaviness that made even the most skeptical utility worker uneasy. Rumors spread quickly that someone had died of plague in the kitchen, that the government had been testing a new chemical and lost control, that the diner had been built over some cursed land from before the war, anything to explain the sick feeling people got just standing near it. By early 1967, under a quietly executed zoning order, the property was razed overnight. No ceremony, no notice in the paper, just the grind of bulldozers at dawn and the sharp scent of diesel and broken tile. In its place came nothing, just a patch of cracked asphalt that served as overflow parking for a used corner lot where not a single vehicle ever sat longer than a week. Yet the legend never died. Locals whispered about the booth, where an old man had started shaking uncontrollably, or the sugar container nobody would touch. Children dared each other to stand on the old foundation lines at midnight, swearing they could hear coughing or smell burned toast in the wind. But what none of them knew, what wasn't revealed until the FBI unsealed case file number 6017-74B under a limited access declassification order in 1999, was that the truth had always been far stranger and far darker than anyone imagined. The report, buried in appendix sections and addenda labeled non-public disclosure, detailed the presence of a Soviet-engineered neurotoxin, the suspected reemergence of a long-missing assassin, and a quiet war waged not with missiles or tanks, but with a poisoned cup of coffee. In 47 pages of once-redacted transcripts, diagrams, and agent memoranda, the file laid bare a story of chemical precision, psychological warfare, and bureaucratic paralysis. The kind of operation that made headlines only when it didn't happen, the kind that evaporated in the heat of plausible deniability. For historians who stumbled upon the file in archives, it became a ghost story with footnotes, an unspoken testament to how close the Cold War came to touching ordinary life. The poisoning at Miller's Grove was never officially attributed to any foreign actor, nor was anyone held accountable, but in the margins of the report, one line appeared again and again in different forms. This was not a tactical strike. This was a demonstration. And so the diner became a whisper, a cautionary tale for counterintelligence trainees, a case study in how warfare could enter through the smallest cracks: routine, repetition, and trust. It needed no battlefield, no bomb, no grand announcement. All it took was a man in a suit, a few grains of powder, and a sugar jar in a diner no one thought twice about, until it was already too late. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more Cold War secrets that history tried to bury. Want more stories like this? Comment "More Cold War" below.